Hello and welcome to Crops TV. I'm Matt Helmers, Director of the Iowa Nutrient Research Center and Professor in the Department of Ag and Biosystems Engineering. Wanted to talk today about balancing nitrogen loss and drainage, or balancing drainage and nitrate loss. There's a long history of drainage in Iowa, and drainage is really important for the crop production that we have in the state of Iowa. I like this slide, kind of illustrates what backbreaking work it was to drain our landscape. This is from over 100 years ago, a 54-inch block tile in northern Boone County. A colleague that works with me, it's near his family's farm. When those systems were installed in the early to mid 1900s, most of those were designed with what we'd call a drainage coefficient of about 0.25 inches per day or less. The drainage coefficient is how much water we can get out of the drainage system in a 24-hour period. So if it's 0.25 inches per day, that means we get about 0.25 inches off that whole drained area in a 24-hour period. Because of our land use changes, changes in precipitation, modern drainage designs would be designed with a drainage coefficient of 0.5 to 1 inch per day. So just kind of giving a little background on drainage and drainage system design, but our modern designs would be greater drainage coefficient per day. And really what we're trying to do is get water out of that kind of top 1 to 2 feet of the soil in a 24 or 48 hour period so that we can get air back in there for our roots so we don't waterlog our soils. While drainage is important, and we'll talk a little bit more about drainage, we're also concerned in many of our agricultural landscapes on nitrate loss. And I like to start with why is it a concern? And there are multiple reasons why this may be a concern. First and foremost, the nitrate nitrogen that we lose, some of that, not all of it, and we'll talk a little bit about that, but some of that is of nitrogen that was applied. So we are losing a resource that might help us with crop production. So first and foremost, we don't want to lose it because we don't want to lose a resource or an input that we've paid for. But then as we think about if we have lost it, there are some downstream concerns. Local drinking water, there is a maximum contaminant level for nitrate nitrogen in our water of 10 milligrams per liter. And there can be some local municipal water supplies that are getting close to that, or some of our private wells that might exceed that. Then there are also regional and national water quality concerns, things like hypoxia in the Gulf of Mexico, but also maybe locally algae growth in some of our streams. So nitrate export from our agricultural land to our downstream waters is a concern not only for from a producer standpoint, but also societal standpoint from a water quality perspective. So just kind of first a few slides on drainage. I thought there's a couple really interesting pieces of information out there that kind of illustrate the impact of that waterlogging conditions on crops, which really illustrate the importance of drainage from our crop production. So this is from work that a colleague of mine in Missouri, Dr. Kelly Nelson in Northeast Missouri, did, where he was able to flood these different plots. And so we have a no flooding condition in the lower right-hand corner. We got 1 day in the upper left, 3 days upper right, and 7 days in the lower left. And you can see, even that 1 day of flooding, you can see maybe some signs of negative impact on the crop production. Certainly we see it with 3 days and then 7 days. So, if we can have, and this is, I should say, this is a 16 days after that 7-day flooding treatment was drained. I think really what this illustrates is that drainage is important to keep us from having waterlogged soils, to help us with crop production. Another piece of information, kind of from some of the same information, but is looking at what was that grain yield with either 0, 1, 3, or 7 days. And you can see, especially in 2014, that slope of that line, pretty dramatic corn yield decline. We're going from about 14, in this case, megagrams per hectare down to about 12. So about, almost a 20% reduction with 3 days of flooding in those conditions. So again, illustrating drainage is important for crop production. But how does nitrate move to our streams in those tile drained lands? That's where we see some concern. And so if we look at this schematic here, we have our land surface, we get precipitation, we have some evaporation and surface runoff from that, but we have infiltration through the water profile there. That is where most of our nitrate is moving. It's moving with that infiltrating water. And then in our tile drain landscapes, that water is intercepted by a tile line and delivered right to the stream. So you can see the red dots there, most of that in the tile line going to the stream. You'll notice couple red dots below the tile. We have some deep seepage, and we would see some nitrate loss there as well. But in our tile drain landscapes, the vast majority of nitrate that gets into our streams is coming from that subsurface drainage water. That gray pipe there that's taking that water and nutrients. So sometimes we hear about nitrate runoff. Really, it's nitrate that's moved through the soil profile with that water, that infiltrating excess water, and then into a tile line and delivered to the stream. That's how we lose most of the nitrate in our landscape. So how do we balance drainage and nitrate loss? And there are a lot of things we can do, and we're going to talk a little bit about that today. But first and foremost, from a crop production, drainage does benefit. But as we look at this slide, that drainage delivers nitrate to downstream water bodies. So one of our challenges is that year-to-year variability really impacts nitrate loss. So the next couple slides are just illustrating maybe some of the challenges with just reducing nitrate loss with in-field nitrogen management. It definitely first starts there, but we're going to need to do more than that, and that's where kind of integrating with the drainage system may be important. So in 2 slides, we'll get to that. But first, this goes through 30 years of data from our drainage water quality site near Gilmore City, and the green line squares there is our annual drainage. And so you can see in 2018, we had about 26 inches of drainage, about that in 1993, and then there'll be some dry years where we have hardly anything. The blue circles there is the flow-weighted annual nitrogen concentration, and you can see that varies from year to year as well. And a low in 1993 when we had flushed that system of about 6 parts per million, and a high in 2013 of about 21 parts per million. So about double the drinking water standard. And then the triangle, orange triangle, is our nitrate loss, and that varies year to year, but closely follows the drainage or the pattern of drainage. So if we look at this, following the same nitrogen management system this whole 30-year period, the average nitrate concentration is about 15 milligrams per liter, or about 1.5 times the drinking water standard. So even when we're following reasonable management, about 150 to 160 pounds of nitrogen per acre to our corn crop as an early season side dress, we still see nitrate concentrations in excess of that drinking water standard. Okay, so some would say, well, we'll just reduce our nitrogen application. That may help us a little bit, but we've looked at no nitrogen application in a corn-soybean rotation over a period from 2015 to 2020, where the no nitrogen plots had no nitrogen that whole time. So it wasn't like we re-randomized things. Those, in this case, 8 plots, 4 in corn, 4 in soybean in any given year, had no nitrogen. And what we found was that we only reduced the nitrate concentration from about 12 milligrams per liter, in this case at this site, with a fall or spring nitrogen, to about 8 where we had no nitrogen. So, we had a 30+% reduction with no nitrogen. But it's important to note it's not down to 0, still some elevated levels of nitrate. So kind of illustrates that even if we use the best nitrogen management in our fields, we're still going to see some nitrate coming out of our tile line. And what can we do with that? That's where we'll go next. Not talking today about cover crops, but cover crops would be another infield practice we could use to help us reduce that nitrate that's leaving the plant root zone and might be intercepted by the tile line. But just a couple slides to illustrate that just nitrogen management, we're unlikely to get to the goals that are out there. Iowa Nutrient Reduction Strategy has a goal of 40+% reduction from our agricultural sources. So we're really not going to get there with just nitrogen management if we have a corn-soybean rotation. But there are some other practices we can look at. And the last one is that I'll get to here is the one I'm excited about and want to spend a little time talking about, kind of balancing that drainage and nitrate loss and crop production. But a few just kind of background edge of field practices. We have a subsurface drainage bioreactor where we're routing a portion of the drainage water through a carbon media, in most cases a wood chip trench, promoting denitrification and having less nitrate delivered to the downstream water from a drain line. We have saturated buffers where we're intercepting that tile line again and forcing a portion of that drainage water through shallow subsurface flow below a buffer to promote denitrification of that water. Can be very cost effective and really cost effective in cases where we already have a buffer in place. But again, we can see both saturated buffers and bioreactors, we might be able to reduce downstream nitrate delivery 40 to 50%, depending on the site and the conditions. A little bit bigger practices are nitrate removal wetlands. And so in this case, we're taking drainage water and subsurface flow from a small watershed, could be on the average of 1,000 acres, and having a wetland pool there where we can promote denitrification. That wetland pool might be on the order of 1% of the contributing upland area. And with that 1% pool, long-term, from the monitoring that Dr. Bill Crumpton has done, we might expect about a 50% nitrate removal from that system. So pretty cost-effective when we think about, about 1% of the land for the wetland pool itself, removing 50% from the upper lying areas. And, beauty is in the eye of the beholder, but might also provide some aesthetic value as well. On a smaller scale, in some of our river valleys, we might have oxbows that can be restored and where we can route drainage water in there. So when we say multi-purpose oxbows, that multi-purpose is that we're routing drainage water into that oxbow to promote denitrification. So we think saturated buffers, bioreactors, wetlands, multi-purpose oxbows, all are practices that we can route that drainage water into, promote denitrification, and decrease the downstream nitrate delivery. So understanding we need that drainage, so we're going to have the drainage there, but we're going to treat that nitrate before it moves downstream. Okay, now the next edge of field practice, and a way that we can think about balancing drainage and nitrate loss, and maybe even the environmental economic factors, So balancing drainage, nitrate loss, and the economic factors would be what we would term drainage water recycling, so a DWR system. Really, this system has many different components, and the different systems, depending on the topography and the landscape, might take on different forms. But in essence, what we're doing is we're capturing drainage water, we're going to store it, and then we're going to use it for supplemental irrigation or for crop production. Those of you that might have a rain barrel at your home or wherever you live, this is a little bit like a rain barrel on steroids. Now, we'll talk a little bit about the different systems we have. You could gravity flow. If the topography was such, you could gravity flow that drainage water into the pond and then pump it out. And then we really just rely on an irrigation system. On the right there would be a center pivot that might be used in some cases. I'll show a couple sites where we're using that. You could also look at putting water back in your drainage system. If you're on a pretty flat field, if you have pattern drainage, you might be able to put water back in the drainage system and use what we call sub-irrigation. And so we're going to have the water flow from the drain to midway between the drain line in these cases. So we're putting water back in, promoting lateral flow from the drain line to midway between to enhance our crop production. So if this works, there's a lot of pumps involved, maybe a little bit different system, but what we're doing is we're storing that water that would have otherwise gone downstream. So that drainage water would have had nitrate. We're going to store it keep it there and reuse it rather than letting it go to a downstream water body. Okay, so we've been working with the Iowa Department of Agriculture and Land Stewardship and the Iowa Soybean Association on a few sites across north central Iowa from Lake City to Dayton to Story City, right across there. So between Highway 20 and 30. First one near Lake City, there's an inflow there on the upper right corner of the picture. That's the inflow. It captures drainage and surface flow from about 2,000 acres. We have an inflow sampler to sample this reservoir when the water comes in. So that water comes into the reservoir. This one has an outflow during high flow conditions. So in this case, we're not storing all the water. We're just storing, kind of what we can in that landscape position. And then there's where the reservoir sampler is right near where there's a pump that would pump water to the center pivot there. And so that the green area there, the pivot area, that's where we're putting irrigation water on when that crop needs it. So, but in this case, we sample the inflow in the reservoir and then the outflow sampler as well. So we sample how much water and nitrate comes into the system, how much water and nitrate leaves the system, and then we also quantify how much water and nitrate might be going to the pivot area as well with that irrigation water. The second site near Story City, in this case, what we're doing is we're capturing a little bit of drainage water from where you see the pivot area, but this producer has a withdrawal permit from the stream and is pumping water from the stream into their reservoir. So that water that was going down the stream was most of it, the vast majority, would have been drainage water from somewhere upstream that would have been delivering water and nitrate to a downstream water body, in this case the South Skunk River. But they're pulling some of that water out and putting it into the reservoir to then use within that pivot area. And so we have the irrigated area of about 58 acres. The reservoir is about 2.5 acres. And in this case, the inflow is either that supplemental pumping or unmonitored tile flow. No outflow in this case. So all the water that we're taking from the stream, it would either be lost by evaporation from the reservoir pool, seepage from the reservoir, or through irrigation put into the pivot area. Okay, and our last system near Dayton, in this case, they're pumping from a drainage main into the reservoir and then pumping from the reservoir to the center pivot area. And so we sample what comes into that reservoir from that pumping, and then what's the quality of the water that's in that reservoir. So this one, irrigated area of about 105 acres. The reservoir, taken about 3 acres for that reservoir there. And the inflow to that reservoir is pumping from the drainage main. And again, no outflow from this system. So really all the water that goes into the reservoir is used for irrigation, or some would be lost to evaporation or seepage from that system. So we've been fortunate to monitor the Lake City site for 2 years. The Story City site also for a couple years, although in 2023 they never pumped water into that reservoir, so there was really no inflow. But for the Lake City site, we had about little over 4,000 pounds of total nitrogen, about 4,000 pounds of total nitrogen as inflow to the reservoir in 2020. Outflow from the reservoir, from the weir at the outflow, was a little over about 1,200 pounds. The irrigation that was applied back onto that 50-some acres was about 1,000 pounds. So we were, roughly in that 20 pounds per acre. We estimated maybe 30, 40 pounds or 200 or 300 pounds lost to seepage. If we look at the inflow versus that outflow, so the inflow versus outflow condition, we saw a reduction of about 63% reduction in total nitrogen delivery to the downstream waters as a result of that reservoir there. So both from denitrification of the water that came in there, as well as using that water for irrigation. We saw that 63% reduction. For 2023 at Lake City, the percent reduction was even greater, where in 2022 is a 63% reduction, 2023, 92% reduction. But you'll notice the total pounds reduced were greater in 22 than 23. So we had about 2,600 pounds in 2022, whereas about maybe 1,600 to 1,700 pounds in 2023 at that site. But anyway, ranges from a 63 to 92% reduction in delivery to downstream waters. If we look at the system at Story City, both of those, really were reducing. Seepage is really kind of about our only factor for the loss there. In either of those, we're seeing 90+% reduction. So in those cases, we kept 400 pounds in Story City and about 900 pounds at Dayton. That's how much we kept from being delivered to a downstream water body. So, as we think about this, really one thing we're very concerned about is how many pounds of nitrogen are we delivering to a downstream water body. In both of these cases, by putting water into that reservoir, using it for supplemental irrigation, we've kept the vast majority of that nitrate from being delivered downstream. We've kept it in the field and used it for that supplemental irrigation. While that water's in the reservoir, we also see denitrification. So that's why you see, not as much going out in that irrigation, because we do see denitrification of that water as it's stored in that pond. But as we look at these three sites over 2 years, we kept on a low end about 400 pounds and on a high end about 2,600 pounds of total nitrogen from being delivered downstream to the local water. So I think that this shows this practice has some real potential from a water quality perspective. But as we think about this from a producer perspective, this is all great. Another water quality practice, Matt, but what does it do for helping us on farm? Well, this drainage water recycling is one that has the potential to help us on farm with that through that supplemental irrigation. And we're still looking at the 2023 data. So kind of be on the lookout for that. And we're going to continue to evaluate at these three sites going forward and maybe some more sites. But we have a history going on about 10 years at our Story City site. And so at that field, we had about 50 some acres irrigated, but then there's also a control area that's not irrigated. And the farmer supplied us with yield information both for the treatment area and the control area. And so from 2010 through 2015, there's 5 corn years there where we have yield data from the treatment area and the control area, where the treatment has no irrigation. And what we find is that during those years when drainage water recycling was not used or there was no supplemental irrigation, we saw that the treatment area underperformed the control area by about 3 bushel per acre, or what I would say is hardly any difference between the treatment and control area, in yield. But if we look at the 5 years where we used supplemental irrigation, 2016, 17, 19, 21, and 22, you'll notice in all those years, the treatment area, the yellow hashed one, treatment with supplemental irrigation outperformed the control area. And if we look at it on average for those 5 years, it's a 43 bushel per acre annual increase with drainage water recycling. You'll notice kind of a couple of the years, especially 2017, had the greatest, about 100 bushel yield benefit, over 100 bushel yield benefit. That was a year when we had very low rainfall. Specifically in June of that year, it was locally what they call the flash drought. They were able to start irrigating in that year and saw a really substantial yield benefit. So, as we think about these practices and balancing drainage and the need for drainage with nitrate loss, we need that drainage for crop production. But what if we store that water to keep the nitrate from being lost downstream, but use that for supplemental irrigation. I think our early work is showing that it's feasible to do that with drainage water recycling by storing that water, keeping the water and nutrients locally, reusing it on the crop. We can see a reduction in downstream nitrate delivery, and early indications are that we can see some yield benefit. The next questions are, how much yield benefit might we get? Is it economical? Those are absolutely the questions that we're working to ask. As I said, we're working with the Iowa Soybean Association, Dr. Chris Hay there on some of this, and the Iowa Department of Ag and Land Stewardship. But those are our real questions as we move forward, but I think it has some potential. And the economics are going to vary from site to site. What's the pumping cost? You have to pump into the reservoir and to the center pivot. All of a sudden you have two pumping costs versus the one site we have at Lake City where it's gravity fed into the reservoir and then irrigated from there. So each site's going to be a little different. That's kind of why we think there's a need for research in this space to quantify both the water quality and crop production impacts of this type of practice. If you are interested in nitrogen management, tillage, cover crops, and some of these edge of field practices, I just encourage you to go to the Iowa State University Extension store. There's the Whole Farm Conservation Best Practices Manual. Has some nice decision trees for you, if you have land, to think about what might work on your land and some of the factors to consider if you are thinking about a practice to implement. And I guess just kind of one of my take-home points, we talked a lot about drainage and nitrate loss and some of the practices we might use. But one of my take-homes is that we're going to need it all. We're going to need good infield nitrogen management. We're going to need cropping practices and land use, things like cover crops and extended rotations. And then we're going to need edge of field practices like the saturated buffers, bioreactors, wetlands, and drainage water recycling if we want to reach some of the water quality goals that are out there for us and balance our drainage and nitrate loss from our agricultural lands in Iowa and really across the upper Midwest. So with that, that is my contact information or my email on Twitter or X account. Feel free to email me if you have any questions or comments about this. Appreciate your time and hope you have a good day and that you enjoy watching some of the other Crops TV episodes.